Hey everyone, welcome to this special night at V2. For those of you having an eye on the chat, we just popped in a link to a survey that you could click on, and then it redirects you to a survey that is part of a broader research that we are in, that this program is part of a European program looking into mobility and mobility within AI. So if you want, we'll start in a few moments, but if you feel to fill in this survey, you can just click the link. It will be there throughout the program. So if you feel maybe in the break, you want to fill it in, feel free to. Then one other announcement is that this night will be recorded. So we, as the people that you see, the panelists here, we don't see the audience, so we don't see your video, but it's nice maybe for you to know that this is being recorded. And this talk will also be shared online afterwards, so that if you want to go back to it at any point, you can find it online, but we'll let you know where to find that afterwards. All right, then I think we can start with this official evening. Today we already had a lovely workshop with Alexandra, which I will tell a little bit more about later. First, we're at V2, or at least I am at V2. Most of you are not, actually. So maybe for those who haven't been at V2 yet, hopefully you will soon. A little bit about V2. So V2 is the Lab for the Unstable Media, which is an interdisciplinary center for art and media technology in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. So that's where I am currently. V2 presents, produces, archives, and publishes research at the interface of art, technology, and society. So at V2, we create a context in which issues regarding the social impact of technology are explored through critical dialogue, artistic reflection, and practice-oriented research. So we'll also get into this research today together. To create a little bit of context, which is actually nice because yesterday we had another event where Alicia Juarrero was with us, and she actually spoke about context. And how we're all interdependent of each other. So this particular program actually fits into a broader program, which is a European Creative Europe project called Artificial Intelligence for Futures. And this broader program involves 3 different European countries: Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands. So this AI4Future program aims to enhance the understanding and dissemination of AI-related technologies and brings activists and artists together to cooperate and create awareness through the use of artificial intelligence to serve the community. So this team, this international team, consists of skilled organizations working on cross-fertilization projects at the intersection of digital culture and social challenges. Our partners are Cineglossa in Italy, Espronceda in Barcelona, Meet Digital Culture Center in Milan, and Sardegna Teatro in Sardinia. If you are interested on knowing more about this project, because this is a 2-year project that we just started, you can have a look at AI4Future.eu. We'll pop that in the chat also a little bit later so that you can just click it. It's also on our V2 website if you're interested. But we'll come back to that. Yeah, before we start, my name is Sita. I work at V2 as a project manager, and I'll gladly introduce our fellow researcher, René Turner, who's also with us here. René has been a fellow at V2 since 2021. And René is an artist and writer whose practice engages with digital narratives, archives, and interdisciplinary collaborative inquiry. Whether working collectively or on her own, her research is informed by feminist perspectives and the entanglement of sites, histories, material encounters, and embodied subjectivities. René is a senior lecturer at Willem de Koning Academy and a researcher within the Rotterdam Arts and Science Lab. And I would love to give the floor to René.
Thanks, Sita.
Oh, you're still muted.
Oh,
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I hear you.
Oh, just one moment. We're switching. Yeah. Something's right. Try again.
Can you hear me?
Yes, got it.
This wasn't this the word of the year or it's phrase of the year? You're on mute. So thanks, Sita, for that lovely introduction, and thanks everybody at V2 who's making this technically possible. So the idea, when I was first asked to be a fellow at V2, it was proposed that, or I was asked if I would look at gender inequality in AI. And I asked, or I proposed to V2 that rather than creating a kind of series of events, that instead I would create a means of inquiry. And so I proposed forming a slow reading group, and that we would read together texts. And the idea with slow reading was to kind of understand that we're in an urgent situation, but perhaps should resist the terms and conditions of urgency. Because in many ways it reiterates a kind of neoliberal approach where speed and efficiency are reiterated, and sometimes that doesn't allow for inquiry to happen and also to even imagine otherwise. So V2 was really generous and they've supported us and doing this slow reading endeavor. And since January, we've been reading on a weekly basis, texts together, a group of slow readers. And later on, you'll get a link to our slow reading site that lists the people in that group and also some of our activities. But just to give you an idea, some of the texts that we've been reading, we've read seminal essays such as Turing's Computing Machinery and Intelligence, specifically the section on objections. Maybe in that sense, we wanted to kind of know what the piece of sand was within the oyster from the very beginning, the frictions. We looked closely at data sets and filtering parameters. We read Francisco Varela and Umberto Maturana, their work, Autopoiesis and Cognition. We read On the Dangers, more contemporary texts, such as On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots. This is the text that led to Timothy Gibru's firing from Google. We employed different reading methodologies, and I have to say that these methodologies emerged out of our group process, trying to think about how we could sabotage our speed in a way. So we read out loud, we did choral readings, adjacent readings, ruptured readings, annotated readings. All the while, we were taking collective notes, and also documenting vocabularies used to sort of understand the density of those vocabularies. Reading words through a tapestry of accents, we synchronized, desynchronized, and resynchronized our voices around the sentences of others, looking for ways to speak through disciplines, but across disciplines. And most of all, we tried to preserve, although it wasn't always easy, the ethos of slow. And by slow, I'm kind of thinking here of Isabel Stenger's in Another Science is Possible, a manifesto for slow science. She writes, "It is here that the word slow, as used in the slow movements, is adequate. Speed demands and creates an insensitivity to everything that might slow things down. The frictions, the rubbing, the hesitations that make us feel we're not alone in the world. Slowing down means becoming capable of learning again, becoming acquainted with things, reweaving the bounds of interdependency." And tonight's talk with Alexandra Mason we're continuing, hopefully, with this speed. It will be moderated by four slow readers, Linda Wan Lee, Christina Kokior, Noemi Biro, Agathe Beilein, and Michelle Turan. And so now I'm going to hand the mic over to those other slow readers, and they're going to introduce themselves and Alexandra Mason.
Oh, is that me? I'm waiting on y'all, right? Okay.
No, we introduce ourselves and then you. It was just the unpleasant. It was the uncomfortable pause, Alexandra.
I gotta learn to be slower, like y'all.
Maybe I'll start. I can't see myself, and maybe you can see me, but I'm just going to speak. I'll be. My name is Michelle Turan, and I'm an artist and researcher. A practice-oriented research professor at Ludity Academy. My areas of interest are around transmedia storytelling, socially engaged art, site-specific art, speculative fiction, feminist practices, and critical pedagogy. Agathe?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Agathe Bell. I'm a PhD candidate in computer science at Utrecht in the Netherlands. And generally, I work both on developing methods to better explain how AI systems make predictions, especially computer vision models. But I also work on looking at how bias is framed in computer science and critically reflect on that and what is not taken into account in this frame. Linda.
Yes, unmuted. Hi, my name is Linda. My background is in architecture and art history. I'm interested in the biopolitics of the built environment, looking at how the body is shaped through disciplinary regimes of space and form and standardization, but also by the pharmacopornographic regime named by Preciado. Yeah. Next is Christina.
Yeah, I'm a designer and researcher. I work with and around systems of knowledge organization, and of course, not only, I'm part of an art and technology collective called Varia, where we work on notions of everyday technology, community-run technology, and collective infrastructures. And I'm interested in the logics of AI algorithms and the possibility spaces, which is a term that we discussed yesterday also with Alicia, that it enables across different disciplines. And to introduce our speaker tonight, Alexandra Mason. Alexandra completed her master's degree at CUNY's School for Labor and Urban Studies and her undergraduate degree at the New School. She has given talks in Europe and the US, including Sonia De Jager, who is also a slow reader and is here in the room with us. Her Regenerative Feedback Festival at WORM in Rotterdam, and NYC's Issue Project Room, Seattle's Red May 2017, and helped lead 2018's class of interpretation in Prague. Her writing has been in Glassbead Journal's Darkroom, Somatic Reason, and Synthetic Eros issue, and her ideas have been published in High Tech, a magazine by High Snobriety. Her work spans various topics, including cultural criticism, social movements within America, and more recently, the nature of libidinal economy in regards to personal and collective forms of desire. Alexandra has worked on various projects with Anon, a techno-futurist, left accelerationist collective. We're really excited to have Alexandra with us tonight. We've been having very pleasant an hour and a half earlier, where we've been speaking about libidinal economies, feminization of labor, body in the flesh, objectified flesh, and then a lot of different topics, actually. We went through her text, Shattering the Vessels, together, which also connects to also with the lecture and workshop yesterday, so it was a really brilliant back and forth of ideas. like considering notions of reciprocal relationship between the body and the culture it is part of, as well as the self being formed through reciprocal relations with others. But a lot of other things that will be distilled tonight. It's a pleasure to have Alexandra speak with us tonight about one of her more recent texts. And thanks so much for being here, and the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you. I'm gonna try and take my time here. So I have a couple phones that I have to like look at everything off of. But okay, to start off, I wanted to make the beginning of this sort of a like meta talk of sorts. Part of this talk is like a ramble about the event and why we're here to begin with, and the piece itself before I actually get into it. So when putting this together, I was told that there was some, maybe not concern, but like some thought about how this could fit into the idea of AI. And not to be too critical, but to explain this, I think we need to pull back and look at the nature of this event itself. So if, as the event's description says, the aim is to sketch the scope and entanglement of AI systems to plot spaces of mobility, agency, and refusal, then we must first think of how to do this within ourselves. In other words, if the event is about making space for gender and equality in technology, here concerning a very specific kind of technology, then it makes sense to first question the basis upon which we rest these superstructural arguments, which is the central aim of my essay. The other aspect of this event that I'm arguing we should maybe examine more closely claims to be geared towards, quote, against the pace of infinite urgencies surrounding AI and gender inequality, and embracing deceleration, end quote. I think this presents a lot of things that we are conflating possibly, and that maybe we can like swim in and disentangle. So in trying to connect this with my essay, I looked at various notions of deceleration in regards to gaming. Let's put this. Oh, quick question before I keep going. Can y'all see the box that I see of us also in addition to the slides, or are we just good on the slides?
Just the slides.
Oh, okay, sorry, because I can see your box, so I was just making sure. All right, good, let's keep going. Okay, so in trying to connect this with my essay, so I looked at various notions of deceleration in regards to gaming. On the one hand, if we were to take ideas from the slow games movement, which claims that games are, quote, made rapidly with attempted ruthless efficiency that is blunted only by inconvenient human needs, which are soon mangled by the machinery of the games industry and thrown out, after which they are like quickly reviewed and thrown out. Here, the idea of speed simply means to take more time developing and also playing games, and to think more critically about the subject matter within said games. Of course, these are things that I agree with, and if the idea is to focus on slow engagement, where games are examined over a longer course of time, this is also something I can agree with and something that I think the essay does directly. So, however, it goes without saying that fastness in terms of movement or speed, although I know that's not necessarily what deceleration means here, is bound with the function of many technological tools and aspects, AI included. And moreover, many of the complaints that can be made here are possibly general ones that could be made of capitalism in general as a mode of production. The problem that AI presents at its core is one of safety versus efficiency. In that, I mean, systems like AI need to typically rely on large amounts of data in order to perform well. If we truncate this in any way, which would give us more safety, it would probably be at the cost of performance or how well the AI can perform in some sense. To connect all of this with the subjects brought up in the event description, which aims at thinking critically about this tech in relation to issues of gender inequality, I'm arguing we will need to actually reorganize and rethink what makes up the quote, capital W world. Instead of thinking about solving these issues at the level of representation within gaming or within the realm of tech, maybe we should think more about the kinds of materials we use to create use it to create, as opposed to appeasing liberal standards of representation, which often takes a numerical form. So to connect this to the quote from my earlier essay that we looked at, there, quote, exists a relationship between the subject's pornographic imagery and the political sphere, with the former being a vulgar reflection of the latter. Pornography, which in this instance refers to images, items, and subjects associated with the sex trade, functions as a receptacle for hidden desires. Gender, as we know, is linked to ideas of subjectivity, but I'm also here to argue that it's linked to what is sacred and profane. If we want liberation in a certain sense, we will have to revolt against respectability politics and the idea of polite society. With all of that said, I am not a computer scientist, I'm a theorist. But to be very direct, there are literal uses for artificial intelligence that can be easily fathomed to or attached to my essay, as my essay is about a specific kind of game. So it's a sandbox game, which is basically any game that allows for non-linear play that may or may not have a clear-cut objective. So that would be The Sims, Minecraft, and online social platforms like Second Life. Those are all examples. So it's possibly easy, for us to conceive of ways in which AI can be used. If you need me to be even more specific than that, the game that I'm examining here in this sort of meta review that I did, Degrees of Ludity, contains a number of NPCs, so that's like non-playable characters, who are essential to the game's playable experience. These can interact with the player in many ways, depending on what setting the player chooses and what choices the player makes throughout the game. And although these vary widely, they have usually been planned out before by the developer, like well in advance. One use or possible use of integration for AI in this instance would be to use it with the non-playable characters to broaden the variability and open up more potentials within gameplay. So basically, I believe, all of that said, the question we should be asking is, how can we harness the potential in something like capital C capital, which differs from accumulation under capitalism, towards leisure and introspection, and away from a system which, as it stands, requires that we dedicate all of our time and effort at the expense of our own self-cultivation. So with that said, I'm going to go into the essay. Debates around gender and sexual identity are currently framed from the standpoint of a subjective historical narrative that is then used to categorize a particular group by its relation to said record. While identity politics may serve useful in one sense by offering an account by which groups can examine and coalesce together beneath, such discourse may not be useful in offering a way of escaping the often binary structure with which these arguments are framed within Western society. Instead, I argue that what is currently relegated to the realm of gender identity and sexual expression, regardless of the society, actually refers to a psychosocial space which carries cultural attitudes towards that which is sacred versus that which is considered profane. Thus, rules around sex acts and bodily behaviors or presentation have a relationship to the law, as it is through this that citizens are bound to a set of regulations and expectations in relation to their actions and how they appear within society. Typically, the original formation or genesis of laws intended to regulate the body have a material basis or origin to them. So for example, rules placed over the female sex in order to try and ensure propagation of the next generation of citizens, from which the logic of classifying and othering sodomy flows, and we remain bound to the essential structure of these arguments, even in cases where their historical basis seems outmoded or easily challenged. While the specific nature of which codes or symbols a particular society uses to mark or identify those who do not carry out functions set forth by the law may vary, these simply mask the true function of their psychosocial space as reservoir. If, as Foucault notes, it is not through sexuality that we communicate with the orderly and pleasingly profane world of animals, rather, sexuality is a fissure, not one which surrounds us as the basis of our isolation or individuality, but one which marks the limit within us and designates us as a limit, end quote. Then transgressive art and literature may be the very thing that is needed to speak at the heart of what is taboo, as it forces viewers to migrate towards the borders of what they consider sacrosanct. In this post, or this essay, I will explore the potential of transgressive art as something that has the ability to challenge dominant ideologies through an examination of the online game Degrees of Ludity, as well as grindhouse films. This will be examined in relation to what Deleuze postures as a masochistic modality, which differs from its colloquial usage and instead refers to an agent who actively and knowingly places themselves in a passive position in order to shape their own drama, the act through which they are actually able to subvert power relations. Spurred on in great part by Flash's end of life in December, as well as boredom caused by being stuck inside during the pandemic, I decided to spend time playing porn games online in a sort of nosedive into nostalgia. As one of the longest running components of the internet, developed originally in 1996, Flash has been responsible for some of the web's most popular games like Bubble Shooter and Angry Birds. This computer software was also used in the creation of shows that helped popularize the lo-fi look of Adult Swim cartoons from the mid to late 2000s, such as Metapocalypse and Squidbillies. Among many uses, Flash was often utilized by smaller developers and artists in order to create 2D animations or interactive games. This led to the creation of portals dedicated to hosting such games, such as Miniclip and Newgrounds. Early versions of Flash allowed for graphics and animation editing in small digital sizes that made it ideal for downloading via web, and eventually the creation of fully immersive and interactive sites that were seemingly complex for the time, but could still run over a dial-up connection. This software was provided free of charge and made available across multiple platforms, which allowed for its spreadability across the web and ultimately resulted in most browsers utilizing its capabilities. Though much of the internet was already prepared to move beyond Flash well before its expiration date, or had done so already, fumbling through this erotic landscape by playing around on this original Flash-based sites made me wonder about what, if any, greater theoretic connections could be made. Though shorter Flash games like those in the Meet and Fuck series were highly entertaining, I was able to finish them in short succession within a short amount of time. While comedic and stimulating, the games lacked the depth and length that I craved. Eventually, what caught my eye was not a Flash game at all, but an HTML5-based sandbox text game that, once I started, I couldn't put down, Degrees of Ludity. According to the developer Velnir's site, the aim of Degrees seemed simple enough. Quote, you play an 18-year-old boy or girl in a town full of people with lewd intentions. Go to school and find honest work, turn to a life of crime, or sell your body in more carnal ways, end quote. Such instructions, while presented as straightforward, skip over the more emotive aspects of the experience that one has while actually playing the game. Far from an easy ride, gameplay is immediately jarring, for lack of a better word. Throughout the game, your customizable character is immersed in a hostile environment filled with assault and corruption. Almost every character can pose a threat, from teachers to strangers on the street. Though the game's themes would undoubtedly seem controversial to some, I wondered if there was not something to be gleaned from the experience of playing, as someone who is often interested in looking for novel ways of approaching media that most might deem salacious. When examining mass media communication technologies during the late 80s and early 90s, Felix Guattari posited that such tools present a twofold path through their use, with one road leading towards the possible dissolution and blebbing of larger firms, and the other leading towards a technocratic dystopia. Yet, what makes the internet different than, say, television and film is the sheer volume of content that it amasses because it is driven almost entirely by user participation. In a cultural sense, attempting to steer the internet in a more open direction will require us to do, at the very least, to provide a counter discourse for understanding material that others may find abhorrent, as well as rethinking the role desire formation plays within society. The argument could be made then that art mediated by or disseminated through the use of modern technology, such as erotic games, may help individuals accommodate a masochistic relation to power. Contrary to colloquial uses of the term, a masochistic modality allows for the expression of historic and social guilt in an eroticized way, which gives some forms of erotic material the ability to activate fantasy, as opposed to disinhibiting it or only activating it in addictive or maladaptive ways. However, without careful consideration, this modality can be rerouted back into frustration, anger, and lashing out, as much of the unbridled rage of American male teens in the past 30 years has shown, with online hubs having served as incubators for reactionary forms of culture, such as Gamergate and incels. Though anti-porn feminists like Julie Bindel, Catherine McKinnon, and Andrea Dworkin did not specifically cover pornographic games within their work, it would not be a stretch to say that such thinkers like Dworkin, who was an outspoken critic of pornographic transgressive stories, like Bataille's Story of the Eye, would vehemently oppose pornographic games and media like it. Julie Bindel, operating off of the notion that pornography is just prostitution with a camera, has referred to OnlyFans as a vaguely sanitized porn set, a digital space that allows for exploitation. She has similarly chastised Pornhub as vile in the extreme, end quote, and points to videos of forceful encounters, whether staged or not, and rampant racism within videos on the site as evidence to substantiate her point. For feminists like Bindel, there is no differentiation to be made between the porn industry, sex work, and pornography. In fact, she even fails to differentiate between different kinds of sex work within the trade itself. For someone like Bindel, the ills of commodified sex, particularly its most violent aspects like human trafficking, are inseparable from the production or creation of porn. Sites like OnlyFans are, to her, exploitive because of the narratives some sell on there, with some engaging in things like daddy or daughter role play and fetish play, even when the content creator is fully in control of how their work is produced. To some degree, her brand of feminism brings back more liberal stains of sex-positive feminism to reality, as they tend to link the occupation of notions of empowerment, which, while offered as a theoretical comfort, ignores claims from far leftists that all work under a capitalist mode of production is inherently unfair. Moreover, there is some merit to claims that a serious representation issue lies within the world of porn production, where the kinds of roles that are given to non-white actors tend to follow racialized scripts. While amateur porn can diversify the types of narratives actors can choose to show, which offers creators more autonomy and comfort, this is only made possible through firms that extract from earnings that creators make. In other words, those who support a hardline anti-pornographic stance fail to differentiate between various kinds of porn or different trades within sex work, sometimes going as far as to flatten out all pornographic production and sex work with illegal drug trades or human trafficking, while leaving out amateur porn or other kinds of erotic materials like online porn games. Though some kernels of truth may lie within such critiques, one could say that criticisms of the ways in which pornography is produced are criticisms that could be made of work under the current mode of production in general. Eliminating the illusion of particularity within anti-porn sentiments illuminates the fact that the act of singling out pornographic production as a locale for unsavory elements within society is an arbitrary one. Conversely, popular pro-porn arguments tend to follow the logic of rights under liberalism and thus misguidedly assume that one, freedom to do something within modern society is automatically linked with happiness, and that two, the pursuance of happiness in and of itself will help one live a fruitful life. Additionally, when framing counter-arguments that are pro-pornography, some, especially far leftists, make the mistake of placing all blame for anti-pornographic attitudes on the overarching state, which is subsequently cast into a scary autodidactic specter. Such an argument obscures that the road from private viewpoint to representation within the public sphere is less unidirectional and more related to a complicated set of interests, mechanisms, and pseudo-legislative bodies that change hands over time. While the outputs of historic tension between male-coded and female-coded individuals can be measured in various ways, such as through the pay gap, identifying what, if anything, should be salvaged about pornography is a far more difficult task. This is because in modern society, what is pornographic refers to the spectacular. The mediated gaze of desire transfixed to the image as a focal point, a stimulus which cannot be measured or directly observed outside of its semiotic arrangements. What is currently deemed feminist discourse is typically thought of as a series of movements which are often framed as in conversation with one another and arranged sequentially. Such movements are typically focused on identifying and categorizing patriarchal codes or outputs. Such obsession with identifying codes led some to claim that the so-called fourth wave feminism of the 2010s and on, with its emphasis on an active stance against microaggressions such as manspreading and mansplaining, to be too individual or subjective. Yet, though feminism as a concept has existed now for decades, it has yet to look at the ways in which feminism as a discourse itself has possibly permeated or penetrated the field of what is considered male-coded or patriarchal, the target of its criticism. While it advances and progresses off of its own history, which is typically seen as an internal dialogue between movements based around central issues, such as second versus third wave feminists and how each handles the concept of sex positivity, it does not look at these arguments from the perspective that the introduction of such concepts in and of themselves may have had an effect on the dominant term within the power structure it aims to assess. A quick search for the term mansplaining on Fox News shows us that when we are able to zoom out beyond the scope of the left or liberal feminism's history, a larger structure of circuitry is at work, through which feminist vocabulary passes. In an article that covered the hearing of controversial Trump Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett, the outlet quotes a tweet which claims that she was interrupted by the Senator Cory Booker 9 times in less than 20 minutes. The senator was accused of doing the same thing to Department of Homeland Security Secretary Christian Nielsen 3 years prior in a meeting over remarks Trump made about some African and Latin American nations being, quote, shithole countries, end quote. While the earlier article admits to the novel nature of the term, quote, Booker's hostile tone prompted Michael Ahrens to invoke the millennial term for males talking down to women, end quote. The latter uses it without qualification, through which we can infer that by the time the term had ultimately been absorbed into mass culture. Here we can see just one small example of the way in which the right, which is here used simply as a stand-in for whatever encapsulates the sphere associated with the dominant term, tracks the introduction of a new term by feminists and tries to use it to its advantage, which in a roundabout way legitimizes and solidifies feminist terms even further. Though examining issues of sex and gender by tracking concepts in their absorption or rejection by various actors over time may serve as useful from a historical perspective, it does not necessarily offer a conceptual out from such tensions. Thus, in order to try and reorient discussions around gender and steer them towards new territory, I offer the idea that what we currently speak of as the tension between male and female, as well as the tension between heteronormativity and homosexuality in critiques and discussions of gender expression within society is, in actuality, a sort of psychosocial space which functions as a repository for cultural attitudes towards that which is sacred and profane. In modern societies, this is based on conceptions of that which is considered dirty. In Purity and Danger, Mary Douglas explores the relativity of dirt, where she posits that cultural laws have historically been used as a way of maintaining symbolic boundaries, that where that which cannot be neatly categorized or classified is seen as that which is wrongful to harm or improper to do. Douglas claims taboo is a spontaneous coding practice which sets up a vocabulary of spatial limits and physical and verbal signals to hedge around vulnerable relations. It threatens specific dangers if the code is not respected. Some of the dangers which follow on taboo breaking spread harm indiscriminately or on contact. Feared contagion extends the danger of a broken taboo to the whole community, end quote. Though she originally conceptualizes kosher law as another example of a reaction against that which cannot be neatly categorized, she ultimately revises this notion to include that such prohibitions within kosher law on unclean animals are, quote, not based on abhorrence, but part of an elaborate intellectual structure of rules that mirror God's covenant with his people. She claims, of land animals, the people of Israel may only eat those which are also allowed to be sacrificed on the altar, which restricts them to eating only the species of the land animals which depend on the herdsmen entirely for safety and sustenance. What may be burned on the altar may be burned on the kitchen. What may be consumed by the altar may be consumed by the body. The dietary laws intricately model the body and the altar upon one another. Abominable here refers not to modern conceptions of the word, but the idea that God finds abominable that which is still cared for. Still, both examples that fall neatly under her general premise, as well as those deemed to be an exception to the rule, carry with them the possibility that if the makers of opinion want to prevent freedmen from marrying slaves or want to maintain a complex chain of intergenerational dynastic marriages or wish to extort crushing levies, whether for the maintenance of the clergy or for the lavish ceremonials of royalty, a taboo system that supports their wishes will endure. Criticism will be suppressed, whole areas of life become unspeakable, and in consequence, unthinkable. Douglas relates this to the notion of risk, which functions as a way through which an accusation is mounted against certain kinds of behaviors, and points to actions which should be stopped and are located through shared cultural logic. Ultimately, Douglas claims some taboos reinforce redistributive policies and others prevent government or individuals from accumulating power, end quote. Additionally, classification and identification act as cornerstones within societies throughout time. The notion of the patriarchy as a societal force is one that casts women as a class, which requires protection and includes the introduction of a generalized system of implicit codes, which appear to us as social and legislative regulatory frameworks. In Women and Children First, Laura Miller articulates this when she notes, In Western mythos, civilization is necessary because women and children are victimized in conditions of freedom. Introduce women and children into a frontier town, and the law must follow because women and children must be protected. Women, by virtue of this childlike vulnerability, are thought to live under the constant threat of kidnap, abuse, murder, and especially rape, end quote. If we expand this understanding of gender to the idea of changing codes which mask a psychosocial sphere as reservoir, we can also place in here the tension between the heteronormative and homosexual world, as what this sphere holds consistently is a unified logic, and the function of the sphere remains and exists to encapsulate a society's feelings towards propagation and how social life should be organized. If, as Athena Athanasio has noted in Dispossession, the performative in the political, quote, in the scene of subjectification, desire and the law are inextricably intertwined, end quote, this seems to set a bleak picture for the possibilities for revolt against this framework. However, she further notes, in this performative intertwinement, gender and sexual categories, identities, and fantasies are reconstituted and reinvented in unforeseen ways as the law strives to reduce, affirm, consolidate, thwart, commodify, or render them proper. Perhaps it would be critical to reflect on the ways in which constitutive and regulatory, as well as the relation between them, get fabricated, reshaped, rewoven, and reassembled in this provisional and contestable process. So my sense is that the disruption of the conceptual transition between constitution and regulation is a way to suggest that the means through which gender and sexuality are regulated can also be the condition of the possibility for their emergence, end quote. If we conceive of technology as something that maintains a sort of dual potentiality, where one end leans towards a singular form of control versus smaller nodes that contain the possibility for collective ownership, then the question remains whether or not such tools can be used to generate art that challenges the basis of what we consider acceptable. White flight from metropolitan areas in the US, like New York City, into surrounding suburbs, as well as divestment from large companies, left many once thriving areas desperately in need of funding. As a result, many movie theaters began transforming into grindhouses in order to fill seats. These establishments mainly showed exploitation films or movies created with little to no budget that contained large amounts of sex, violence, or other risque or bizarre content. Though these kinds of films were being created since the 1920s, and some shortly shown for a brief period of time before the restrictive Hays codes of the blank to blanks were in force. Sorry, that would be like from the, I think until it was about from the Hays codes, yeah, from about the 20s to the 40s. Their popularity is typically associated with the 60s and the 70s. These kinds of topics and nature of the material covered in these films were in stark contrast to those created by Hollywood studios just a few decades prior, with a relaxing of the Hays codes that ruled from then to an overturning of previously pro-censorship rulings, such as those handed down in Jacobellis versus Ohio. And shifting attitudes in public opinion allowed for a space where smaller or no-name directors could show their experimental films. Though the content in such movies are notorious for their content and they might seem to rely on stereotypes and over-sexualization, YouTube essayist Daniel Netzel notes, in the old exploitation films, you saw a lot of representation, a far cry from the typically all-male and all-white cast of most films during the era where women were just eye candy or romance options. Movies such as Faster, Pussycat, Kill, Kill certainly show this, as an all-female cast roams around in the desert and are portrayed as strong leads, and by contrast, most men in the film are scripted as forgettable or simply characters that help advance the greater plot. Other examples include Pam Grier's roles in Coffee or Foxy Brown, where not only is a Black woman portrayed as a lead character during a time when this was otherwise unheard of, but she is painted as in control of her own sexuality on her own terms, as opposed to being forced to play nice within the parameters of a white world. In fact, audiences probably saw these movies just as much to learn about the shameful, taboo subjects as to enjoy the sexual titillation and carnivalesque atmosphere of the show, end quote. If we can look to exploitation movies as part of a low-budget film era that placed viewers in touch with controversial material while forcing them to think critically, maybe similar potentialities lie within and amongst the digital landscape of the internet. If, as Michael Ubel notes in Towards a Symptomatology of Cyberporn, men have been exposed to 30 years or so of the discourse and political efforts of feminism, are men who, for one reason or another, know it is unacceptable to evince the outright patriarchalism that was part and parcel of American social life until feminism asserted itself. What results as a tension between the enlightened consciousness of the American male at the end of the 20th century and a patriarchal sedimentation so old it is indissoluble. The tension is then reconciled phantasmically through a masochism that, on the face of it, seems to involve a forfeiture of dominance, but that in fact is nothing other than a compensatory mechanism, one that, at the level of fantasy, allows for the restoration and consolidation of masculine power. Let us be clear. The postmodern male is unwilling and often unable to assume the sadistic role McKinnon has assigned to the masculine subject generally in patriarchal society, but through masochism can achieve the semblance, the affectivity of that power without having it linked to violence, end quote. So for this part, because I'm gonna go back to the game, I guess I'm gonna look back at some of these slides because they're from the game itself. What's most interesting about Degrees of Ludity is that you can alter your playable character or your PC in various ways. You can change how non-playable characters or NPCs interact with you based on the choices you make, which occasionally determines how they will interact with one another. And you can change the characteristics of the people and animals in the world with you. Thus, you can change both how you project yourself to others as well as the nature of the characters you interact with, as opposed to many other erotic games where you walk through the world as a PC experiencing a set or a possible set of outcomes and move towards a given endpoint or outcome. According to the site, the outside world you play in can be altered in terms of people who will be attracted to you, while fetishes such as tentacles can be toggled off in settings. Yet this description truly undersells the game's litany of options. Not only can you alter the appearance of those who you encounter, you can also alter the percentage. You can also change the nature of the encounters within the toggleable features. Some toggleable features can alter your appearance, most notably encounters where parasites become attached to erogenous zones that can increase the size of those parts over time. As a sandbox-style game, Degrees of Ludity did not have to necessarily have a clear-cut objective. However, Velnier chose to set a fixed objective within the game where the player owes orphanage caretaker Bailey money every week. According to the game's wiki, these payments are one of the few repeatable quests given within Degrees, and it is introduced to the player upon starting a new game and demanded from the player weekly. These payments increase each week as Bailey becomes more greedy and extorts the player for what they're worth, ultimately being capped at £2,000. If the player does not pay, they will receive some sort of punishment. If the player decides to date Robin, a particular NPC within the game, then their payments are doubled to $4,000 a week. Punishments for non-payment become more difficult than the last as Bailey attempts to sail the player to the highest bidder. They include 1, being sold to a fancy dinner party to be used as pudding for the attendees. 2, being sold to Eden, a hunter or huntress, who takes the player into their cabin in the forest where they become Eden's property and then are subject to many BDSM-related demands while being held captive on the farm. If the player has Stockholm syndrome, this will be seen as a rescue instead. 3, being sold to Remy, a farmer who maintains both a teaching class at a local riding school and also operates an underground farm where the player will become cattle to be held amongst their cows. Or 4, being sold into sex trafficking via an underground brothel. While you have control over your appearance and gender presentation and sex within the game, the one condition you cannot change is the overall tone of your environment, which is a harsh one. The game's toggleable settings may help you dictate the specific nature of the encounters you can run into, but in some ways, this is just dressing your executioner. In effect, though the settings are vast and complex, regardless of what they are, players are confronted with the blatant output of a patriarchal world, albeit in an exaggerated and more obvious form. In essence, you're not really safe anywhere. In my personal experience, this made gameplay very jarring and disorienting until I was able to establish a weekly routine. In order to try and make the payments, I found I had to prostitute myself around town in addition to tutoring, dancing at a strip club after school, and working at a nearby cafe. I also worked heavily on my strength so I could fight off attackers more easily. Within the game, it is also possible to make money via skullduggery or scavenging in the forest for treasure, amongst other things. Additionally, players can determine how they feel towards the actions in the game, which then dictates how actions will affect your trauma score or other attributes. The player can lower their trauma score in particular by performing actions that they feel in control of. Depending on the player, this can be through sexual acts they enjoy, through interacting with characters that lower their stress level, or through rebellious violence. In my personal gameplay, it was through interactions with Robin, who I ultimately chose as my love interest, and prostitution that I was able to self-soothe. Degrees acts as a model that makes patriarchal relations all the more apparent by immersing the player in a ruthless world where all one can do is search for acts and whatever makes them comfortable, if only for a minute. Options which usually can only be found within the game outside of its set institutions. By doing this, Degrees actively forces players into an othered modality, but does so in a way that cuts at the core of what we find abhorrent in the process. Many of these online erotic games, because they are not bound by the confines of corporeal society and its rules, experiment with more Baroque features and offer more representation and present more experimental attitudes towards sexual acts and fetishes than in traditional pornography, but without the accompanying historical narratives that mainstream porn finds it must cater to. In Must We Burn de Sade, or de Beauvoir goes over strengths and criticisms of de Sade's work and thought. On the one hand, she claims he is able to, through the way he handles taboo subject matters, show that the relationship between the self and the other is often linked through the use of cruelty, and that such stories help illuminate the peculiarities of our existence. However, she claims his drawback is precisely his reliance on the world of the flesh, by which he places all vested interests in its triumph, and in doing so, posits a sort of moralism as opposed to freedom, albeit an unsavory one which confuses power with liberatory potential. Thus, the world of the masochist is a magical one, and that's why de Sade is almost always a fetishist. Objects such as shoes, furs, and whips are charged with emanations which have the power to change him into a thing, and that is precisely what he wants, to remove himself by becoming an inert object. Sade's world is essentially rational and practical, end quote. Similarly, Deleuze claims that Sod's masochism and Sod's sadism and Massock's masochism are neither linked through two external nodes that are bound together, nor are they, as Freud posits, two nodes that both lie within each subject, and that rather, quote, subject or number, quantity, and quantitative participation were at the specific obsessions of sadism, end quote. Whereas Massock's masochist, quote, experiences waiting in its pure form, end quote. It is through this preoccupation with disavowal, suspense, fetishism, and fantasy that a masochistic modality is able to offer new paths in thought. In addition, masochism is neither material nor moral, but essentially formal. We need, for the understanding of the world of perversions in general, a genuinely formal, almost deductive psychoanalysis, which would attend, first of all, to the formal patterns underlying the process, viewed as formal elements of fictional art, end quote. We can pair this with de Beauvoir's conclusion that what truly brings us close to eroticism is risking oneself to the lure of emotional intoxication and radical vulnerability. In addition to books like Venus in Furs, films like The Last American Virgin and Mishima, A Life in 4 Chapters, bring viewers closer to a masochistic modality through which transgressive works are sometimes expressed. Degrees of ludity can, depending on how one plays the game, occupy a more sadistic frame of reference. The player acts as overseer from a third-person point of view and moves the narrative along by selecting from a catalog of actions and elements within the game, which subjects their character to a litany of consequences and pushes the boundaries of what they find morally acceptable. The work of Peter Sotos or the music of Whitehouse helps achieve the same effect by submerging you in a world that many often would never dream of touching, but through which severely contingent realities are created and clouded, end quote. Other works that could be slated in this category include John Waters' Female Trouble, which follows the escapades of a lifelong delinquent, or Bruce LaBruce, Raspberry Reich, which centers around a terrorist group dedicated to breaking heterosexual norms. Though such films explore transgression more or through satirical humor, the effect of placing viewers alongside uncomfortable topics and bombarding them with difficult to handle scenarios remains the same. Still, for all of the possibilities transgressive art seems to offer, it makes sense to mention that artists and works slated within this category often suffer from an issue of representation, particularly where visual mediums are concerned, although it is not completely devoid of diversity with writers like Iceberg Slim, H.P. Elwee and Lawrence Hubbard, Tori Morrison, and Donald Goines, having produced works that explore taboo topics. Taking this into consideration, this is all the more reason for marginalized people, in particular, to delve into such topics and present transgressive art to audiences. This is especially so amidst the current social media landscape that, while it offers seemingly novel ways for individuals to monetize their own pornographic content like OnlyFans, runs alongside a real and present attempt to commercialize the web. Recent legislation within the US, FOSTA and SESTA, has been particularly damaging, and along with the online culture wars of the Trump era, has led to an increasing amount of censorship on social media, forums, and streaming sites. Additionally, in terms of current media, though a greater amount of on-screen representation exists, it is often through big budget production studios such as Disney, who are often only willing to show a diversity of faces without offering challenging narratives or anything that might upset the viewer, which simply helps reify the notion that art should be made for a common sensibility. Ultimately, if we conceive of gender and sexual expression as a psychosocial space, it is with transgression that we can cut at this edge with a knife. And That was it. Oh, this is just a little bit more of the game. This is how I played the game. I played as this. So just to add a little bit more before we wrap up and go to Q&A. I played as this character over here. And you can definitely play as multiple different skin tones and stuff, but you have to do it before you start the game. So since I had already started, I was like, well, I'll just be like a blonde stripper girl, I guess, and I'll rock through the world in that way. But I was really impressed by, I guess, like the amount of options the game has and what it allows the user to do and the experience that it puts the user through. So with that, I'm done.
Thank you, Alexandra. I'm guessing a lot of people within this meeting would be curious where to find this game.
Oh, it's just online. It's
online, right?
Yeah, anywhere. A Degrees of Ludity. There's like a wiki. It's online. Through multiple sites will have it. Just search it and go for it.
All right. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation of your experience with the game. I think after this essay, maybe take a 5-minute break for everyone at home, also in the pace of slowness, maybe grab a drink, run to the bathroom. And then we'll be back here at 8:15. So we'll take like 5 minutes and then come back and we'll go into a panel discussion for a little bit more interaction. See you in Hey, welcome back, everyone. Lovely. I see, or we just saw that there were a few questions already in the chat coming up. So yeah, I would love to give the floor to the slow readers and maybe to mention for everyone who's here in the audience, if you pop a question in the chat or the Q&A, we can unmute you so that you can actually voice the question and we can you can make yourself being heard. So yeah, just if you have a question, use the chat or raise your hand and we'll make sure that your question gets asked. All right, welcome back, everyone. Thanks again for that beautiful essay you shared with us, Alexandra. Very interesting. I would love to hear what the slow readers thought about it.
If I could begin, it's a bit of a processing. So, and I have a tendency to meander a bit. So apologies in advance, Alexandra. But I'm just trying to weave together some of these moments in the reading group, and also, I guess, from our session earlier on today, and also the conversation from yesterday. But I was maybe I would like to bring in a little part of the essay that we sort of immersed ourselves in this afternoon. And just to read from it, so to talk about the attitudes towards technology within popular discourse can sometimes veer towards overzealous optimism or technophobia. Visions of the future, whether dystopian or utopian, are anticipations of that which is not yet. And I like this "not yet." It's what else and why, and it's a very sort of indeterminate, sort of middle space kind of term. And how do you sort of sit in the "not yet"? And I think that this is kind of like the "not yet" that I feel when you're talking about this game. And you're talking about like these kind of transgressive space. I mean, there's a number of like really sort of poignant terms that you've dropped in your presentation, sort of notions of risk, of dirtiness, of unsafety, transgression, as I said, lowering your trauma score, radical vulnerability. These are some of these things that you came up with. We had talked about yesterday, or Renee brought in sort of the notion of the question of what are the literacies needed to grasp complexity, and how do we inscribe ourselves into another future, and how does what are the systems that come in, and how can we complicate them? So I was thinking about this notion of dirtiness, and you I think you brought in about I'm thinking about this term about the revolt against respectable politics, like the pureness of a political position. So I'm sort of like weaving these things around in the air, and the balls in the air, and I'm thinking about some things that I've come across in the last months, one or longer term. One is sort of this relation of like what Walida Amarisha is referring to as visionary fiction, and Octavia Butler's sort of use of transgression, where she really sort of plays out these very sort of like ethically complex scenarios of a rape occurring and simultaneously occupying both the position of the perpetrator and the victim, or sort of playing with notions of pedophilia, or proposing sort of these different sort of polyamorous interspecies relations, so really exploring with transgression. Or on the other hand, this whole area that focuses on pleasure activism, which is kind of like this counter strategy of activism needing to be sort of like this, savior, extremely sort of like purist, sort of putting yourself through these almost an aesthetic kind of trajectories, and not sort of exploring sort of the joy and pleasure of communal mutualism and all of those kind of polluted territories. And so, yeah, I mean, if I could just another drop in this term that has come across my plate just recently, called ethical attunement, right? And it's really sort of talking about, there's this collective process of experimentation, and this kind of willingness to make mistakes and just completely sort of muddy things up. So there's this infinite possibility of, things that don't immediately sort of put into these binaries of good and bad. So it's just not really going anywhere, but it's really just kind of processing what you have said.
Well, if y'all want, although I realized there was like a typo to cell left on there, y'all can it's on a blog. I can just give y'all the URL now if you want to pull it up on your phones or whatever makes it. So it's sad girl theory, like crying sad girl theory.wordpress.com. And then we can if it's easier, but thanks for all those, yeah, especially the Butler point. I think, yeah, that's basically getting at the heart of what I'm sort of talking about. I think when creating these when we're trying to revolt against these older structures, we tend to be really good at thinking about notions of maybe violence or rioting or all these very important flashes that need to happen in order for us to sort of tear down everything that exists. But maybe we don't always focus on, I guess, the mode of pleasure, particularly, that we might find in these new types of societies. Of course, we couple them with things like mutual aid, with service delivery. But what about, a far leftist idea, or not gonna far leftist idea of pleasure?
I just wanted to say that as I was listening, I was thinking, I had a kind of flashback of early web. And I had two books in my mind. One was Alicia Stone, or Sandy Stone's book, The War of Desire and Technology at the Close of the Mechanical Age, where she really speaks about this potentiality of the web to be an identity, to occupy an identity other than your own. Even there's a beautiful description of the erotic nature of doing phone sex and the way you unpack the body through a telephone line, and sensuality. And at it's either in the foreword or the end of that book, there's a sense of mourning, of understanding what's to come with the web and its commodified, as a money generating machine. And then I was thinking about Julian Dibble's book, My Tiny Life. And in that is an essay, it's also from 1998, A Rape in Cyberspace. And it's where, and it's in Lambda Mu, which, it's a kind of text-based game, but there's this rape that happens. And then there's this whole discussion about where's the border, what is real, what is consent. And I guess what your talk has done, made me think about those kind of, that the DNA of this split, perhaps, the more puritanical or something, and that of desire was already there in the mid 90s, which is I don't know, kind of fascinating. I'm always interested in how things are built into systems, and unfold over time.
Yeah, if I'm gonna I'll bring up my own thing for a second in this other tab. Yeah, because I looked at, actually, although I guess I didn't make it explicit, also putting this other question in the corner. I didn't make it explicit, but a lot of these essays I looked at actually were, between late 80s, 90s, if we're talking the Guattari, on mass communication models. And in the 90s, at the dawn of the internet, or midway through the internet, if we're talking about that cyber porn essay that I quoted, and also the essay that I used on women and children first, in particular the cyber porn essay, which was just it was more like a transcribed lecture by this psychoanalysis, Michael Ubel. I found that there was a lot that was that could be connected to the internet of today, and also some that maybe we could push back on, because if he's saying there's all these potentials, he's saying there's all this and that, maybe it's a little, is it a little naive? Is it before the curve? Because he's still here, and we're even more at this point, I think, like enmeshed in platform capitalism and stuff like that. Or does that simply mean, which I often think, like it's the internet is just going to become the television or whatever, and then we need to find the new mode that we need. But there is something, I believe, like inherent to the structure of the internet that makes it a little bit less, it's a little less easy to completely stamp and commodify in that way. Because there's just so much, like each thing that's produced on there can be seen as in a discrete element, and that's just so much material that's produced any single day. But I think things like NFTs and other things sort of start to close that gap a little bit more.
And my other question is, when you're playing this game,
okay,
thinking about AI, what's happening to your data as you're moving through, again, thinking about this future that might be built, what's being learned from the persona you're constructing, the desires that you have,
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing about this particular game, because it's off of, like, if it's Newgrounds, or if it's on Newgrounds, or if it's like games like this one was created, I think, in 2018 or 19. It's just made by one kid in their basement type deal. There's like the developer themselves updates it and makes updates to the game. The developer has their own blog where they talk about that. A lot of I guess I mentioned meet and fuck games, those are like more so user-based or small group-based productions. So it's not, that's why I use them in particular, because I think that if we're talking about industries, if we're talking about firms, then even if it's pornographic, sometimes it just replicates the same issues that we have in regular society, which is what I sort of mentioned. Also, I think that there's maybe a misunderstanding that there's a misunderstanding of what I think like the underground economy really is. And I think that sort of comes from this like connotation that liberal society tends to, or we all within this society tend to place on it as being sort of like outside of society because it's raw and it's all this other stuff. But it's a structure. There's like structure to it, and there's hierarchy, there's all these other things. So, and those things can be super problematic too, like gangs or the mob or all these other things. And so more so than what most people would see that realm as, I see it more as just the bizarro world of capitalism. Like,
Thanks so much, Alexandra. I wanted to bring back actually the point of dirt, which I thought was really interesting in how you used this a reflection of Mary Douglas's ideas of things that cannot be neatly classified or categorized. And I think this speaks actually a lot to, for example, this phrase that you often hear when in discussions around bias in AI algorithms, which is garbage in, garbage out. And this refers to you give biased or problematic data set, you get the same kind of output. And I mean, this is a very important, of course, fundamental discussion. But I'm wondering also, this idea of cleaning is equally central in discussions around AI, which is, and it's also an important process before you start working with the data, you clean the data. There are people who are dedicating months, if not years, to doing this kind of work, I think. Agathe can maybe also weigh in. I'm curious about your experience with that. But this aspect of removing anything that is ambiguous or anything that cannot be quantified, in order to be left with computational matter, or things that can be computed, let's say, computable matter is what I mean. Could this aspect of garbage, is it connected in any way, or do you see any parallels to the psychosocial spaces that you mentioned?
So I'm not gonna lie, like I think ideas of cleanliness, I haven't sat down and thought about quite as much. Although I know that a lot of people might typically go through cleaning and these ideas through the door of ideas of ritual and sort of like routine and stuff like that. I'm not sure, because I haven't sat down and really thought about it, if I fully agree with that, if that's like the framework that we want. But I will say, I think like in an indirect way, maybe when I bring up the idea of law, that's sort of the like regulatory mechanism. I think that's the thing that's supposed to set your boundaries and say like, this is not okay because it's dirty. And by that you can infer like what you are to do, I guess. Although, I mean, the law often is more so just like, you can't. And then I guess like we have rights that are given to us and inferred, but that's actually quite recent too, that like we have things, legislative bodies that give us the power to do X, Y, Z. So I don't know if that's like fully getting around to what you're saying, but maybe other people have some things. There are also things in the chat over here, right? I feel like I see one. Maybe I can get to it and then we go back around again. But so someone said, I love how this reveals the possible prototypes for AI porn. What do you think will be different if we already have this? So I am not, again, like I'm not a computer scientist, I'm not like a game developer, and I don't fully know like every single way in which AI can be used in this realm. But I did, like in the beginning, I guess I said like, if you, like an easy way to plug in AI in a really literal sense in this game would be to make the non-playable characters like Robin, who is my girlfriend, or there are other ones like some of the bullies. If you were to attach AI technology to them, maybe you could open up more possibilities and more randomized possibilities within the game, because there are already a lot of things that can happen. And sometimes even the non-playable characters in certain senses will interact with one another, but it's all through the realm and the mind of the game developer himself. So it's obviously like he's thought about it and like just been working on this for years, and sort of adds little additions, adds possibilities, but it's still within a set number of parameters, even though the parameters are quite vast and seem, numerous.
I think that was it from the audience for the moment, right? Was that the only question? Okay. I just for me, what I found really interesting, you write that degrees acts as a model that makes patriarchal relations all that more apparent by immersing the player in a ruthless world where all one can do is search for acts and whatever that make them comfortable, if only for a minute. Options which usually can only be found within the game outside of its set institutions. And you also talk about the masochistic modality. And I'm not an expert on SAD or masoch, so I'm just gonna try to frame this in a way. But it's really, to me, it's interesting because the way you've described degrees of ludity, it's like you're in the sadist world, sort of trying to gain control through the contractual relations of the masochist. But are you the sadist masochist, or are you actually masochist? So are you experiencing masochism as the victim of the sadist, or through the control of the masochist, right, in the game? Because like Deleuze talks about how the masochist is the victim in search of the torturer who needs to educate and persuade and conclude an alliance to then realize the scheme. So it's an interesting way of looking at this relationship, because the sadist, he writes also that the sadist is in need of institutions, the masochist of contractual relations. So where I find the kind of potential resistance here then is looking at where he also says that a genuine sadist could never tolerate a masochistic victim, because the sadist relies on the victim not gaining pleasure. And so in this game, by gaining pleasure, you're then able to flip that around. But I don't feel like the game quite can do that there, because you still have the non-playable characters, right? And then the orphanage caretaker. There's still this institutional sadism that you can't quite turn around. And then I wonder if that's the next game in which, I don't know, in which that kind of balance can be kind of overturned. Did that make sense?
Yeah, no, that is actually
Okay.
like perfect. I love that one.
Okay.
So I would say, I think that the framework of degrees is more sadistic, because if you look, it's more similar to like Sod in terms of like a lot of people will say that Sod is actually not very like erotic. If you look at his writing stuff, because it's always like lists, it's always like you can do this, that, and that. If we go back, I wish I could bring in the slides again, but it's too much. But when I went the toggleable features, if y'all are even looking on your phone or whatever, it is like an entire list of things that you can pick from, that you can modulate. You are the one who's like doing these things to this society. Now within that world, I think that whether or not which side you're on, kind of depends on how you play the game. I'm quite earnest. So I just played the game as if like I was the character and I was trying to get out of there. I was trying to make all the money that I could. I kind of accepted the conditions of the society. And I also didn't do a lot of things that you could do in it, such as the skullduggery, like the stealing aspects or the crime aspects. That's another way you can get through in the game. You also can play around a lot more with animals. There's a lot of like bestiality type things that can happen, and you can go into the forest and you can escape Bailey altogether. Although you can't escape him. Whenever you turn up, like he will like say that you owe X amount of money, but you could like presumably not go back to the orphanage and try to just live your life through the forest, as I've seen some people do. And when they engage in more aspects of bestiality and stuff, they can like turn into wolves and all these other things. So it really sort of depends. I feel like if you are one who wants to go along with the torture of your character, you can totally do that. And you can see how that makes you feel. Or if you want to feel the weight of the world as it is, you can also do that.
Makes me wonder, Alexandra, have you spoken to whoever made this? Did you reach out?
No, I should. I just wrote it. I was like, I like this game, but I guess, yeah, I would ask. I guess I just figure sometimes with these types of things, if they're more philosophic and stuff, like people will be like, oh, that's cool, but what is this? So I didn't, but maybe for future, that's a super, super good idea. Most of the outside sources that I use to talk about the game were through forums that are made for the game, and the game has a pretty comprehensive wiki for every single character and all types of actions that can happen. So I just sort of consulted those things and the game developer's site.
I can imagine the producer of it hearing this and hearing your thoughts about it and how you kind of frame this within a broader in a broader sense. I would just make me very interested in the reaction, like how this would fit into his thinking or her thinking or its thinking. I would be interested in hearing that feedback.
I mean, I'll send it off and I'll let y'all know. Any more thoughts? Any more?
Well, I mean, I also had the similar question as Sita, as like, who's the author, like who's the developer, and who, just wondering like who plays the games. Since that topic has been broached, and maybe sort of bring it to the other question is, well, you talked about the lack of diversity, right? In game developers that it's all the more sort of like, I can't say exactly sure what you said, but to incentivize like that more, for more marginalized groups to be also developing these games. Do you have any sort of maybe sort of information, or have they come across games that are, I don't know, developed by communities or collectives coming from marginalized groups?
Well, I would say in that aspect, I was more so panning back and saying in the realm of transgressive art, period, there's kind of a lack of representation. I don't necessarily know of every erotic game and like who's behind the team, because a lot of it is online and people sort of just do them under pseudonyms or handles. So I don't fully know. I do think that this as a game does offer a lot of diversity. Like I said, you could pick a large range of skin tones. You could pick a large range of genders. You can be, you can be basically any form of anything. You can be trans, you can be anything. And that will also, interestingly enough, impact your gameplay experience. Like people will react differently to you. So if you're biologically female or whatever, and you choose to present in male form, like it'll depend, like how well you can pass will be depending on how like much your breasts have grown and all types of things. And these parts of your body parts don't really, it's not through time, like in real life, like that they grow or whatever. It's through sexual activity. And the more that you do, the more these parts, whatever part will get bigger. Yeah, with that said, like you can, so if you were to do that and you were to dress as a boy or whatever, in certain senses, in certain aspects, like you have, for instance, a math teacher, I believe, that is super into boys. And if you appear as that, like he will like come on to you a lot more. Whereas if you're just presenting as female, he will like kind of leave you alone. He'll still like interact with you and stuff, but it's not as intense. But when you're out in the street, if you are presenting as whatever opposite gender, you might get like assaulted or you might get beat up for it and they might mention it. But you can also, I think, which is also interesting, you can modulate the world itself. So you can modify the type of interactions that you have with people outside of it. So you can do the percentages in such that you have like a lot of same-sex interactions or not, and you can have a lot of like, I don't know, like more futanari, which would be like girls with penises, in the world and stuff like that. You can do all types of things like that. And that to me was very interesting, just the complexity and the nature with which it captures. So now we have a question here, I guess. When speaking of diversity, if we can imagine a future in which all of this role playing becomes more and more augmented, what do you think the effects will be on society? As in, will diversity in society will look dramatically differently as characters in the augmented world become more and more real and characters in the real world seem less and less diverse or interesting? I'm not sure. Let me sit that for a second. So I don't really know. I guess I think like when that's part of the experiment. We don't really know how these things sort of will affect society until we like immerse ourselves in more gameplay like this. I think that maybe, excuse me, while it's really important to have a number, not a number-based idea, because that's sort of what we want to rebel against, but we want to just have more diversity in general, because we want to have more diversity of voices. there is an aspect of it through which like you also have to have a certain mentality, regardless of like, I guess, where you lie in the sphere of identity politics. So that's, I guess, what I'm saying is like, it's important for us to have diverse number of voices, but particularly within transgressive art, and particularly within visual, like movies, photos, whatever, I think that there's a lack of like diversity in that sense, and that will alter the way in which one tells the story, right? So if it's just all a bunch of like older white guys talking about, I don't know, rape, and that's their topic, that's only going to give you sort of one aspect of it. You kind of want to have it come from more and more people. So that's why I brought up like Morrison and other people that could maybe be put in this category. Because I think that just to go on one more second, if you just stick to the idea of diversity itself, you can get stuck in the liberal trap, right? And so that's maybe, if anybody's on Twitter or anything, some of the discussions that are happening around Pride right now for this year, where some people are like, well, we don't want to see any more like of that BDSM stuff, or we don't want to see anybody like who's half naked anymore in the streets. Like that could create like a pride parade, but it would be one that's like more in the polite society category. And I'm saying that you both need to have the diversity, but you also need to have like something that sort of rebels against that.
I was thinking diversity and perversity.
Yes, diversity and perversity. Although some would say maybe that the idea like perversion itself, I like need like a particular term, because some would say that maybe the perversion of itself, although I don't necessarily agree, I know what like you mean, of course, that is still like referring to a structure, right? Because if we're saying that we're perverting something, there's a structure, then boo-doo. But of course I know what you mean, and that's exactly what I mean too. Just something that keeps pushing boundaries. Otherwise it will probably just end up in the realm of corporatism, because as it stands now, we allow corporate entities as well as pseudo legislative entities. That's why I brought up film and like the Hays Codes in America, because those things were not carried out by and not enacted by a particular like legislative body or branch. Those things were carried out by smaller Catholic inspired groups that acted like autonomously to create their own boards. And so there's a way in which both, yeah, okay, like the corporations come down, and yeah, the law comes down, but also us in this society, we tend to well, some of us and a lot of us sort of like tend to have this struggle inside of ourselves with the ideas that have been presented to us within society, and that creates how we begin to auto-regulate ourselves, which is also connected, I guess, to the earlier essay that we looked at. Is there more here? Chat.
There's a question in the chat.
Anya said like the explicit content lobbyists, right?
Yeah, sure, basically.
This reminds me of an anecdote, which is not mine, but actually one of a former collaborator. She was organizing an exhibition on lesbian history of Brussels, and created a website and everything. And then when she tried to access this website from within a library, it was not allowed. She couldn't access it because of this. Apparently, some libraries use this shared thesaurus with blocked out words. And lesbian was part of it because of it being a porn category, and actually one of the most popular ones, let's say. Anyway, like it seemed like an interesting moment when this performativity of the category acts outside of the structures of the porn website where it comes from, and starts being regulated outside of it, and spaces of classical spaces of knowledge production, such as the library.
I mean, that's happening right now. If we're to talk about AI and its current use, it's currently being used across social media in order to identify female presenting nipples and also to censor for words like sex or censor for words like these things. And I guess we just have to ask ourselves within society, if we want to have this like very powerful type of technology put to those types of uses, as opposed to like the service deliveries and the things that we say we want. But as you're kind of noting, there's an element through which users will sort of try and circumvent that. So I've seen online some people, if they can't say stripper, say scripper, like script klub, like spell things are really out of the way because you can't even really use asterisks sometimes. So I think that like then creates an aesthetic for the internet, and after which like a community begins to form. My idea, and this isn't proven obviously, but because we got to see. But my idea is that because people are going to be using NFTs way more, I think that memes are going to take on a different form, and you're going to see more images of the free version of the images being used. So like images more so of the NFTs, but with their like little spheres or orbs on them, so you can't fully take them. I think like memes will just sort of be placed onto those, as opposed to waiting around for just the images to be able to, or just grabbing images from wherever, because with NFTs, I guess it's like closing in on an essential part of the internet, which is a little bit of theft, a little bit of sharing and theft. They run alongside each other in this sphere. And then just one more thing that I wanted to note about, I guess, like the essay itself is both that we are, so like as essay, we're going from issues of scale, I guess. So that would be like external world, like back down into like subjecthood. But there's also like elements of time, I guess, in place, like location and space. So where we're talking about like the internet in the 90s, and we're talking about these modes of communication throughout time. They are, particularly for like film and things like that, yes, like there is a current that I'm drawing throughout everything, but there's also like specific ways in which that particular mode of communication will affect people. So like being able to see, or having to be forced to see films altogether can allow for a certain kind of viewing when it comes to erotic material. Back when porn was way more heavily regulated, particularly here, well, particularly in America, and I'll get to like make it more global in a second. Particularly in America, it was super regulated because it was based off of old English law, common law, and then like America just didn't really write anything into law about these things like profanity and Ludity. It just sort of went based off of like old English law, and then whatever. But somebody, Comstock, I believe, like he decided to set up the idea that like you have to regulate the mail, and from that a lot of like other laws followed. So it was like people would really look through your mail, and it could be like even sensual letters, like I guess toys and stuff like that. But more so than sexual devices, also linked to it were the ideas of being able to seize contraception, being able to seize birth control. And I think in here, like that sort of helps dictate, I mean, globally in a sense, in the global north, that helps dictate the way in which we've had to fight for these arguments. And that might explain why sometimes like people are fighting for both like sexual expression and fighting for birth control at the same time. I think it's like from these like regulatory carryovers. To make it more global, because of that, a lot of the expansion and the undoing of some of these strict codes within America was because places like France sort of allowed it always. Certain places within the global north sort of always allowed for some sort of expression. But to go back to what we were saying earlier between about the connection between this underground and this like above ground thing, like this underground network, it just formed an underground network then. So everybody would go through France and like produce all the crazy porn, and then they would try and like, get it through the mail and then put it through whatever. And they would also do it sometimes under the guise of it being educational, which is connected to, I guess, something I brought up earlier, which is the recent historic connection between the pornographic and the academy, or allowing like, only certain classes to be able to view certain things. But in terms of like, we can actually make and create pornography ourselves, that is, that only is possible through Polaroid films. When we start to make Polaroid cameras, because other than that, think about it, you have to take your camera somewhere to get developed, and you could get kind of like your pictures not even, you know, given to you, or worse, if they're really bad, you could get hit with an indecency, you know, breaking indecency laws or something like that. And so like the mode of like where we are in the history of capitalism as a mode of production definitely like also dictates what we can do. And I want to make that super clear too, even though like I think we can always find this twofold path.
Thank you for that, that great notion of also having the freedom to move in there, but also seeing it very clearly. Yeah, I think looking at the time, we're nearly at the end of our evening talk. Yeah, I feel there's so much more to say, and we already spent a few hours today together, which is very in-depth conversation. So it was really lovely, Alexandra, to have you with us for so many hours and to really get into the depth of your essays and your line of thinking. And yeah, I just want to say thank you for being with us today, and hopefully we can connect in the future. We don't know how it's going to go with the slow reading, but would love to stay connected. I think, yeah, maybe there's some final words that we would like to say, or maybe a final question before we close off, or do we feel like we are complete?
I just want to give a majorly, yeah, thank you. Awesome. It was a super enjoyable talk, and I really appreciate, yeah, like big hands.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me. This has been really cool, really fun. Yeah.
And thanks for taking it slow with us.
I've tried my best, you know, just like, but thanks for forcing me to take that slow, because I think there's something to it as an ideology in a sense, because it's like I was trying at parts, I was like speeding up, and I was like, no, take it easy, take a drink, like, you know, we should pause a little more.
It's lovely to hear that it becomes a practice while sharing, that the slowness becomes an embodied practice. That's great. All right, and I think, yeah, I would just really like to thank everyone who is here. Renee, thank you for being with us and sharing your knowledge and holding this group as a whole as well. Thank you, Christina, Linda, Michelle, Agathe, for moderating today and being here as well. And also for the other slow readers who we can't see, but are definitely here. So Noemi, Danai, who's not here, but was with us yesterday. And Anna, who is maybe in the crowd, I don't know, but Sonia, lovely to also have you here. And also for introducing Alexandra to us. Thank you for doing that. Yeah, I also want to take a moment to thank Richard and Wilco, who is our technical team, who's behind the scenes. You can't see him, but this whole TV studio thing is because of them. So thank you. My other colleagues at V2 who helped, and yeah, our European partners who helped make this possible. So Cineglossa, Sponseda, Sadechno Teatro, and Meet. And yeah, this was also not possible if it was not for the financial support of Creative Europe's program, Creative Industries Fund NL, and the City of Rotterdam. So many, many thanks to all of the above, and for all of the people listening in. It was already, I think, popped in the chat, but we created like a fluid archive of some kind for the slow reading group, that we kind of gathered all our thoughts, and Noemi Biro, who is also here in the chat, she made a beautiful work out of it. So many thanks for doing that. Maybe someone wants to pop in again. Yeah, thank you so much, Sonia. If you want to have a look, you can go there. There's also the bibliography. If you want to add something to there, also Alexandra, if you would like to add anything in there, you are always welcome to do that. I think your work is already in there, but would be lovely to add a little bit to our bibliography. Yeah, and maybe nice, because this is probably not the end of our slow reading group. We don't know how it's gonna further along, but within this AI4Futures, we're writing an international artist call for an artist in residence, and it will be kind of in line with this thinking. So yeah, keep an eye out on the V2 website. Somewhere around this year, it will be posted online. So if you're interested in these yeah, topics, then you can either go to our V2 website, which is up here. You can click on the slow reading group, and then all of the information is there. Also, there's a link to the webpage that our partners made for the Artificial Intelligence for Future Europe program. If you're interested in that, our partner Espronceda in Barcelona is hosting the next sessions online, so you can be at home but also in Spain at the same time, the 3rd and the 4th of June. If you're interested, then you can go to the website, which is AI4Future.eu. It's also on the V2 website if you're interested. So yeah, you can sign up for a newsletter even at V2, or maybe for the Europe program, so that you can keep in touch. And otherwise, you can always email us for questions or ideas. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you, Sita.
Yeah.
Eat some pizza or something.
Yeah, well, I think we'll leave the chat open for like 10 to 15 minutes. So if we can, what we can actually do is unmute everyone who is here. So we can see you, but if you want to say hi or bye or whatever, we can do that now. Yes, let's do it. Don't know how many people are still with us, but
10.
oh, that's nice. Yeah, so thank you everyone for being here, and of course you're totally free to go. The chat is just here if you feel like you want to say hi, or feel free to do whatever.
Hello.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Sonia.
Hi. We don't have. Yesterday there were also video streams, no?
Yeah, can
From-
the image come?
Can we pull up the video as well from the people who are in the audience?
Kan, ik moest even panelist maken, ja.
Yeah, we can do that. Just a moment. Would be nice to see some faces too. Hey, Sonia.
Sonia. Noemi, I'm sorry that we messed up on the technical front there.
Oh, it's okay. It was really enjoyable. Really good.
I think we sent an email to your HR email. For some reason, I have like 5.
Hey,
Hey, Jack. I have like 3 emails for you, but I'm always a bit confused.
I checked all of them, but I just couldn't see the right email. So I was like, it was meant to be.
and well, no, the one that Hogeschool gets, it throws it into your other file. I don't know why it decides it's an other, but okay, slow readers. It was another awesome session. I feel like, and Alexandra, can we steal things from your bibliography, because we're just building references.
Please do go throughout it. So it's at a blog that I like keep up. I'm gonna keep updating. Like I'm gonna start working on my next essay soon. But there are other essays on there about like music, and more so like music in terms of like Afro-pessimism and more like stuff like that. So like y'all, like all of that stuff in it, unless it was like a hard book, I did add like links to like within the blog. So I would just go through that, and you can take whatever you like. Please do.
Great.
Let me know. Let me know when I gotta stay, go, whatever.
No, I think we're all like, because it's 9 p.m. here,
Yeah.
we're all a bit like, at least I am just like, what's going on? Yesterday, I was saying, like, yesterday I spent 13 hours on Zoom straight, like or not almost, so like 12 and a half, from 9 to 9 something. My brain is like melting.
Space.
Huh?
Living in this digital space.
Exactly. Yeah, I can't wait for it to be over, actually. But the good thing is we get to do this. Like, we wouldn't have thought so easily of inviting people from all over the world if, we were doing stuff live.
It makes me less nervous. I'm not gonna lie. You saw me at like every regenerative feedback. I like curled up in the fetal position beforehand. So.
No, you're great every time. So
I think
just nonsense.
It's the thing, right? If you're an introvert, that in some ways this space, at least for me, I have felt less distracted than I would be. Yeah. So what's going to happen to all of us introverts when we have to go back out?
I'm so shook. I feel like that's a thing that like maybe people aren't talking about as much. Like there's all this excitement around going to things, which like I feel, but there's also like a lot of like anxiety. And I feel like everybody, regardless of how you feel about like being introverted, extroverted, is gonna have a weird moment being in like a crowd,
Yeah. For sure. I had it the other day. I saw Christina for the first time in real life. But
she
besides, she had legs. I was like, she was complete from the bottom down. But I was at the school and at the art academy, and I just had this feeling of like, there's people around and they're moving and you have to keep track of them or something, like this feeling that there's people behind you. I'm not used to it anymore. I was constantly feeling paranoid, as if something was happening that I had to pay attention to. And there weren't even that many people. I was just like walking around the building with a few students in it. Yeah. So it's gonna happen. We're gonna have to get used to it again.
We can do nostalgic Zoom sessions. Yeah. Just to kind of like, let's return to Zoom just for consolation.
Yeah. I think that would also be nice.
Hey, thanks everybody. Really. Also the people who've come in the squares here, and we'll pick things up and filter what's been said, right? Another session of slow reading, and then probably the update will go on the V2 site. Yeah. So I give you all the kiss.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, V2, Renee, readers, everyone.
And either sleep well or enjoy the rest of your day.
Oh, it's 3.
Yeah.
You're good.
Take a nap also.
Take care. Yeah.
Nice to see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.